Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. With budget season almost upon us, there's lots of advice going around. We're pleased to have with us today Dr. Christopher Ragan. He is the director of the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University in Montreal. He'll help us look beyond the headlines to examine our future challenges. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me. Happy to be here.
I guess you had a recent Substack article, which I did have the opportunity to read, and you were talking about how Chrystia Freeland, our finance minister, must concern herself with certain long-range challenges. Let's go through those to start off our conversation, starting with population aging. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. Well, so there's nothing fundamentally wrong with growing old. My father always used to say it's better than the alternatives, and I think he's quite right. But what's interesting about the Canadian population, and this is true in many Western countries, is that there were a large number of people born, what we call the baby boom generation, basically between 1946 and the early 1960s. And those people started to hit retirement age about 10 years ago, and they're going to be hitting, more and more of them are going to be hitting retirement age over the next 10 or 15 years. And what that presents some fiscal challenges for our governments. And I don't just mean the federal government, I also mean our provincial governments. So on the federal side, as those people get beyond age 65, they then start to draw old age security. And if they're low income seniors, guaranteed income supplement. Those two things together are the single largest item in the federal budget, and they're probably the fastest growing. They're about 65 billion now and growing. So that is a challenge to see that growth over time, over the next 10 or 15 years. But it's also the case as people get old, they typically then represent a larger drain on a public healthcare system.
Right.
So we spend way more per person for somebody that's 75 years old, for example, than somebody that's 40 years old. It's probably about 3 times as much on a per person basis. And so as the population ages, not only do we give them more elderly benefits, but we spend more on healthcare. Now, I think it's good that we actually spend on healthcare, but just the simple fact of it is that this is going to be a fiscal drain. Now, the OAS and the GIS are a drain directly on the federal government. The rising healthcare costs, and those typically are about 45% of the budget in a province, and fast rising.
Mm-hmm.
So every provincial premier and finance minister knows that rising healthcare costs is a big deal. And so as those costs rise, that's going to be a drain on the provincial budgets. But as we have seen in the last week or two, that then leads to this kind of federal provincial fiscal dance about who's going to pay the money and how much. So this all adds up to a serious fiscal crunch over the next 15 years.
Right.
I don't think this is an emergency, by the way. I think this is just something that finance ministers, federal and provincial, they have to be thinking about, and we have to be preparing for.
And I guess that's the question. Is this something it's a little bit long-term, but the impacts are growing every year. Is that something that should be factored into every budget from now on?
Well, what I would like, I suppose, in finance ministers, again, both federal and provincial, is that they're taking the long view. And if they're taking the long view, it means that you're going to recognize that these rising age-related costs, healthcare and seniors benefits, are going to amount to about 4% of GDP, 4% of national income. Now, today, 1% of national income is about $22 or $23 billion. 4% over the next 15 or 20 years. So again, that's not an emergency situation.
Right.
But you have to decide how you're going to pay for that. Are you going to raise taxes? If so, which ones? Are you going to cut other spending? If so, on what? Are you going to just add this, put it on the credit card, so to speak, and add it to the national debt or the provincial debt? I think there's some problems with that. So I'm not saying exactly how it needs to be addressed. I think we can have a big debate about that. But the point of this column is we need to be talking about this. We need to be thinking about it and planning for it.
Indeed. And of course, what better time to do so than during the budget discussions? Obviously, The finance minister is kind of in the final stages of that. We're going to take a short break and we're going to hear from Dr. Ragan again after the break. Particularly, I want to just drill a little bit more deeply into the healthcare costs and then go on to some other long-term concerns. We'll take a short break. Please stay with us.